Now, let's dive into the recording and media setup page, because it's here that we're going to make crucial choices about the format of our video, proxy workflows, resolution, frame rate. There's all kinds of crucial information that we need to tell the camera in here, and there are ramifications as to our choices about the format, as to how we can work with the camera, some benefits, some drawbacks, all of which we're going to cover now. So let's dive into the menu, and using the mode dial on the top of the camera, I'm just going to flick to page 3, so our recording and media setup page. Right at the top, obviously you can see I can initialize my media in here. Internally, the R5C uses either a CF Express or an SD card. This is where you would find your format media, initialize media options. Now, this is a full frame sensor, full frame 8K sensor in this camera, and most of the time you probably will want to use that full sensor width and height, the full frame of the sensor. However, you can choose to go into a S35 or an S16 mode, both of which are cropped. So they're cropping in on the sensor, and you're using a smaller portion of the middle of the sensor. But by doing that, you're reducing the amount of computational load essentially of the camera, and it unlocks additional functionality. The most obvious of which is that when I'm in full frame, and if I set my main record format, you'll see that at the top, so vaguely speaking, this goes from best at the top to worst at the bottom, although there are some shades of grey there. You'll see that the maximum quality mode I've got here is RAW ST, the standard RAW mode. Now, if I go back, to hit the cancel button, go back, you'll notice as soon as I drop the sensor mode from full frame to S35, because we're cropping in on the sensor, we're essentially capturing a lower resolution from that readout from the sensor. We're reducing the computational load on the R5C, and as such, we're able to unlock a few additional things. So if I go into the main record format now, the most obvious of which you'll see is that the RAW HQ mode has become unlocked. This is the maximum quality that you can achieve on the R5C. Yes, it comes at the expense of a 6K frame instead of an 8K frame. Or 5.9K frame, I should say. So the resolution you can see is now 5,952 by 3,140. So it's a 5.9K readout from the sensor now, which is the same, in fact, as the C500 Mark II. Still a very good resolution, 6K, nothing to be sniffed at. Obviously, the focal length of your lens will now be cropped in, so you will have a longer, this is a 24 to 70. At 70mm, this is obviously going to be cropped in more. If I come out of my menus, you'll see that it still shows, if I just zoom in and out, it's still showing as a 70mm, so it doesn't factor in that crop when it's giving you the digital readout of the lens, which is unfortunate. But obviously 70mm is the 35mm sensor or full frame equivalent. The data rate you can see here is 1,770 megabits per second. So this is the highest quality and therefore largest file size that you're going to get from the R5C. You'll also notice that my frame rate is grayed out, so I can't go higher than 25 frames per second when I'm in this mode. Well, if I'm in NTSC, the 60 Hz frequency mode, then I would be able to choose 30 frames, but let's not split hairs. Now, if I look in the made recording destination, it does say that it will allow me to record to an SD card in this mode, but it would have to be a very fast SD card. You would obviously need to make sure that you could sustain those write speeds. So it makes sense, I think, to just keep a CF Express card in there when you're shooting RAW, particularly a high quality one. I use Angelbird CF Express cards in my R5C, and they allow me to have a very high sustained read-write speed, and they're very reliable, which is what you want. Now, if I go into the Super 16 cropped mode, nothing really changes. You can still see I have the same main record format options, but I can now go up to 50 frames per second in that RAW HQ mode, but I am now only at just under 3K. So I'm 2,976 by 1,570 pixels resolution. That's 448 megabits per second. There's a very specific use case, I think, for that mode. What that use case is, I haven't yet found. It certainly hasn't cropped up in my workflow. But those are some of the additional functions that you'll have when you reduce your sensor size down. I'm going to go back to the full frame. A little warning will come up saying that the following settings were changed and the main record format is now RAW ST, because essentially RAW HQ has disappeared. We're back to that being the maximum. RAW ST is very, very good. Very, very good quality. I've shot several things in that mode and been very impressed with it. You can see our resolution now is the full sensor size, so 8192 by 4320 pixels. And that is a data rate of 1650 megabits per second. So only slightly lower than it was when we were in HQ, but of course it's a bigger resolution. So that data is spread more thinly essentially, because this is an 8K file now. Again, limited to our 25 frames per second when we're in 50 Hertz, but nonetheless, there are a wealth of options in here in terms of format. The RAW ST is great. The RAW LT is also fantastic. You'll see that's still 8K. It has dropped the data rate down to 1070 megabits per second. So you're a good chunk down in terms of data rate. However, that does mean that I now have the option to go up to 50 frames per second. Now, there are different combinations of frame rates, resolutions, and your main record format that are possible depending on your power source. Quite usefully, there is a section I'll show you in the menu which will actually tell you whether or not your current power setup is enough to facilitate what you're trying to do with it. So if I go across right to the end, power source navigation in our system setup, it'll say that it'll check the required power source depending on lens and recording settings. And we have check the required power source, check the available recording settings. So I'm going to say check the available recording settings with an RF lens. In fact, I'll tell you what, if I hit cancel, I'll say with the attached lens, which is an RF lens, but why not be more specific? Select the power source to be used. So I'm using a DC coupler at the moment, using essentially a dummy LPE6 battery, and you can see the following recording settings frame rates are available. So we've got RAW full frame 8K 1 to 25 frames per second, but it also then says RAW full frame 8K 26 to 60 frames per second. So rather unhelpfully, it doesn't tell you which of the RAW modes that is. So the idea is that top one, the 25 frames per second, is the RAW ST. That next one down, the RAW full frame 8K 26 to 60 frames per second, that is the LT. So in essence, if you're using an external power supply, now that could actually be a V-Lock battery, and I've done this successfully with an LPE6 to D-Tap dummy, essentially going out to a V-Lock battery. That also unlocks the 50 frames per second in RAW LT. And you can also use the USB-C PD input on the side of the camera. So the one that I've used very successfully is the Anker Power Core. These give enough wattage to unlock that 50 frames per second RAW LT mode as well. So very, very useful to have those additional power options, not least because they will extend your runtime massively. It's probably worth noting Anton Bauer make a D-Tap to USB-C cable, which you can use, and that works very successfully. The battery life with the LPE6 NH, which is the high capacity batteries that work with the R5C, and I would recommend those ones over the standard LPE6 or even the LPE6Ns. They're fine, but you're only going to get about 40 minutes of recording time on them, which isn't much. In terms of cost per time that you can power the camera, it's the worst option. Having said that, there are a couple of little tricks. So one of which is that if you flick the camera into media playback mode, the battery life extends massively. Let me do it now. So if I press the media playback, You'll see there's, I've got my raw index selected at the moment. If I go to my MP4 index, you can see the couple of files that I've recorded for this course. If we just give it a few seconds to update, there we go. 132 minutes you'll see of life in the camera. Now, yes, I'm not in record mode, but flicking back from this playback mode to the record mode takes, I don't know, a something of a second. It's less than a second, put it that way. Certainly a hell of a lot quicker than turning it off and turning it on again, which is more like 8 or 9 seconds. So it's a very quick process. And when it's in that media playback mode, it's not reading from the sensor, so it's not downsampling from the sensor. It's also, I don't believe it's also activating the fans when it's in media mode either. But there's several things that it isn't doing that it is doing when it's in standby mode, which will drastically extend the life of that battery. So it could be that if you like to leave your camera on, so you're ready to roll quickly, but you also want to conserve battery life, you can see here, standby, I'd be getting 46 minutes for a fully charged LPE6N battery. As soon as you start recording, that's going to drop to probably 30 minutes, to be honest. Whereas if I just remember to flick into media mode when I'm not recording or in between takes, it can actually extend the overall battery life of the camera and the shooting time that you're getting out of the camera considerably, quite some margin actually. So that can be one technique that you can use to extend the battery life. Anyway, bit of a side note there, as we were touching on the relationship between the recording formats and the power source that you're using. So there is a relationship there between those two things which we have to be aware of. Now let's go back to our recording modes, and as well as our raw modes, which, remember, of course, they're raw, so the camera's not going to do any internal sharpening, noise reduction, everything that would normally happen as part of the process of encoding that file onto the media that would happen in the XFAVC, the HEVC and the H.264 modes. That will not be happening with RAW. I know that possibly seems obvious, but I do often hear people using RAW for the first time, potentially with these cameras, and are being shocked at how noisy or how much work generally that image requires. But when you're going into RAW mode, you are saying to yourself, I'm prepared for lots of post-production work here. And you're doing that for an overall aim of getting the absolute best image quality off the camera sensor and putting all of the responsibility for how that's developed in your hands. So it stands to reason that you would have to be a very good colorist and just general kind of DIT to really rinse all of that extra information out of that media. If you don't feel like that's you, if you don't think you have that skill set, then don't shoot in those raw modes. There are other easier ways to get a higher quality image, particularly if what you're after is something that's, color rich and lots of color information. You could just record it into something like ProRes 422 with an external recorder. But to be honest, even the built-in compressed mode, so the MP4 HEVC YCC 422 10-bit, that is the codec that I use most frequently. It is 422, so 50% of the color information is compressed and eschewed, but 422 is still a broadcast standard color information, chroma subsampling, and there's still tons of color information there. It's 10-bit, so that obviously gets rid of an awful lot of banding, and it responds to color grading really well. It's a very nice file to work with. There's only the most extreme post workflows in terms of color are really going to push that signal too far. So you may well find that if your aim is getting the best image quality, but you don't have the skills or the time or the patience or the budget to make the most of that raw image, then you're much better off just leaving it alone. To me, when I'm shooting RAW, I'm most often doing that because I want 444. I want a full color signal with no color chroma subsampling at all taking place. And that would be really useful for green screen, for example. But in terms of, detail and sharpness and clarity and words like that, if you're thinking RAW equals that, you're probably going to be sadly disappointed if you don't have the knowledge of noise reduction, and raw, development tools that you might be using with the footage, if you don't have a full understanding of those tools and how to get the best out of that raw footage, then you're probably going to be disappointed actually compared to if you just shot one of the compressed formats. Now there is an HDMI RAW option here which will facilitate a 12-bit RAW signal to come out from the micro HDMI into a compatible recorder. I'm using the Ninja V here, which is Atomos's recorder. I think I'm right in saying if you've got the correct license, that will still record ProRes RAW, but I think it's limited to 5K. If you're using the Ninja V Plus and you have the correct license for ProRes RAW, then that will give you the 8K RAW signal in its entirety, and you can record that in Apple ProRes RAW. Or, of course, one of the ProRes options without that license. But that HDMI RAW option is specifically to unlock the external RAW recording with a third-party monitor recorder. Beneath here we have the quite old, actually, it's quite long in the tooth, this codec, but it's very well supported, perfect for broadcast workflows where you're handing off. The XF-AVC 422 10-bit codec, it's based around AVC, as the name suggests, so it's the main profile 10-bit AVC, sort of professional version of AVC codec, which pretty much all of the manufacturers have their own sort of variation on this. And therefore, it's been around a long time. It's very well supported. It's broadcast standard 10-bit 422 and works very well. If I flick into that XF-AVC mode and just pop down here we go, you can see that the data rate has obviously come down a lot from when we were using the raw ones. We're now at 410 megabits per second in Ultra HD. 410 megabits per second, that number, it's important not to get too caught up on that data rate number, because it's a combination of how many pixels it's having to render and be spread across. So obviously this is a smaller frame now, this is Ultra HD, it's not 8K. And in that regard, it's quite a big difference in terms of the amount of data that's required to obviously render the image per pixel. So don't be too caught up. There's also the efficiency of the encoder. So H.265 is going to generate smaller data rate numbers, but for the same visual quality as H.264. So it can get quite messy, all of this, but all I would say is just generally don't get too caught up on the data rate. Think more about your chroma subsampling, the bit depth, and things like that, things that are probably of more importance. With the main resolution / bitrate section here, when I'm in XF-AVC, I have additional options which I won't see when I go into the HEVC and H.264 modes. And that's the ability to flick between long GOP and intraframe. For those of you that are coming from a photography background and using video for the first time on the R5C, this can be very confusing. When you're capturing a signal and you're encoding it, there are multiple different types of compression that are used. The most common one that we're familiar with is spatial compression, which is the same as, say, a JPEG. So you know that the quality slider, if it's down in the middle, it's going to be still fairly good quality, but quite a lot of heavy kind of spatial compression going on. It's exactly the same thing with video. That spatial compression is taking place when you're using these AVC, H.264, H.265 codecs. But what's less well known is that there is temporal compression that can take place. Temporal compression is a technique where it only records real frames, which are known as iframes. They're given the letter I just to designate that they're an intraframe, in other words, a real frame. And it's only recording a certain number of those per second, and the other ones are mathematically inferred from what it can see between the changes of those iframes, which sounds crazy, like how the hell would that ever produce a decent image in a professional camera? But this technique has been around for a very long time. It's very, very good. And by only encoding the pixels that are moving in the image and essentially spreading the data rate only to the areas where it needs it, it means that you can have a much lower data rate but maintain an almost identical visual image quality. Long GOP codecs do get a little bit of a bad press. I have come across a number of people who have basically said, I never use those. I always use intraframe. They're better quality. And it is too simplistic to think of it as a quality thing. In terms of pure image quality, it's very, very hard to see the difference. And in fact, the differences you see will only be in areas of the frame if you were zoomed in quite considerably. I would definitely say it's one of those things that you want to test yourself. Do not just take it on someone else's word that long GOP is bad, intraframe is good. Test it for yourself and you'll probably be surprised at just how good it is. In fact, I've done tests where I've found that in interviews, like this kind of setup, where there are large parts of the frame where nothing is moving, i.e. computer monitors and various things in the background, the wall, when you're in long GOP, although the data rate is lower, because the things in the frame are being intelligently redistributed, the data rate is being distributed around the things that are moving or not moving, you're actually finding that with long GOP, there's more of that data rate, even though it's overall it's less, the more of it is allocated to the thing that's moving, that's me, and less of it is allocated to the stuff that's not moving, which actually creates a slight increase in quality in those areas that aren't moving versus intraframe, where the whole frame and every single pixel, whether it's moving or not, is allocated the same, essentially the same amount of data per pixel. So it isn't clear cut, and I would recommend that you actually think about it, because you could be saving a huge amount of space, particularly if you can't afford big memory cards, by using long GOP. And I would definitely recommend long GOP for interviews. Don't ever shoot an interview in intraframe unless there's a damn good reason for it, I'd say. But you can see we have choices with all of these different resolutions. So we have 4K, DCI 4K, 4096, 2160, Ultra HD, 2K, and then we have our HD ones and even 720p down here. Who remembers that? Crikey. If I come, well, let's go back into here, come back up to my main record format. If I move down to the next one, and as I said at the start, this is the one I use most often. This is the H.265 422 10-bit. A little bit confusingly, the H.264 version, so MP4 H.264, is labelled as H.264, as opposed to its kind of marketing name, which is AVC, Advanced Video Codec. Now, I think they've only done that to avoid confusion with XF AVC, but then they've introduced a whole new layer of confusion because then it says HEVC instead of H.265, which is what HEVC is. It's the marketing name of H.265, High Efficiency Video Codec. So if I refer to these as H.265, it's because that's HEVC and H.265 are one and the same thing. If I go into this 422 10-bit H.265 mode, you'll notice all of my long GOP and intraframe options have gone, but you'll also see that I now have the option to go all the way up to 8K, which is pretty cool. If I go to the next HEVC, this is identical, but it's got an extra level of chroma subsampling going on. So this is color compression. So the 420 has half the amount of color information that 422 has. 422 has half the amount of color information as 444, which would be no color compression, no chroma subsampling, but they're both 10-bit. So worth bearing in mind. You could be saving some space. To be honest, I very nearly chose that codec to shoot this, but in the end, I've got fairly big memory cards, and I thought, well, you never know. But actually, I've lit this and made this pretty much as is. I certainly don't intend to be doing any color grading on it. It's wide DR. So I probably could have got away with 420, but anyway, I shot it 422 10-bit HEVC on the C70 there. And then at the bottom there, you can see we've got H.264 420 8-bit. So this is the smallest format. If we look at the data rate, you can see it's dropped all the way down to 150 megabits per second. It doesn't support 8K. This codec only supports up to 4K. And obviously it's 420, so it's 25% of the total color information that's left. It's 8-bit, so there's only 256 shades per color channel. So you are starting now to get a fairly compressed file. But look at the record time, top left, 878 minutes I could record in this mode. Whereas obviously if we look at something like, the raw LT, where we've got a big increase in data rate up to 1070 megabits per second, we're only getting 122 minutes of record time. If we look at ST, we're going down to 79 minutes of record time. Now, if record time is your main concern, actually the H.265 is more efficient than the H.264. So strangely, if I'm in HEVC 422 10-bit, I get 974 minutes. If I go to the 420 10-bit, it goes up to 1,312. So even though that's 10-bit and that's 8-bit, but otherwise they're both 420. Just because the H.264 codec is older, it's a less efficient algorithm, I actually get more recording time with this 10-bit H.265. So why might I choose H.264 then? Well, H.265 is very taxing on most CPUs, particularly Intel CPUs. I've recently upgraded everything to Apple Silicon, so I've got now the Mac Studio and the MacBook Pro 16-inch with the M1 Ultra and the M1 Max. Can't remember which way around it is, but they have hardware encoding built into the chip for H.265, and it makes me not even think twice about this. But I know before I upgraded with my Intel Macs, it was very hard and now impossible to get real-time playback with the H.265 options. So there's a good reason why you might have chosen to choose H.264 in that particular case. So there's lots of different options here for the main recording formats. We have to kind of be mindful of the combination of the recording format, the pros and cons of that format, the potential additional post-production workflow we have with it, the potential struggles we might have with our computer actually giving us real-time playback of that, the available combination of frame rates and resolutions and data rates and long GOP versus inch frame. Once you add all of these things up, there's probably millions of combinations here. So you have to really understand what's chroma subsampling, what's temporal compression, what are the various different benefits of the resolutions versus the frame rates versus the data rates. How does long GOP work? Is it necessarily the devil, or is it actually quite useful? Can your hardware, your computers support H.265? Once you get all of these kind of questions answered, you can make a decision about which is the best format to use.